Imagine this. You are a member of a hastily assembled government commission investigating the causes of the disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. You are under the close watch of Soviet intelligence services. Every piece of information you and your colleagues uncover is carefully examined. Some documents are classified, some are edited, and some simply disappear. In the early stages of the investigation, you blame the plant workers themselves. You accuse them of negligence, of violating procedures, and of causing the accident. Moscow agrees with you. Punishments are already being prepared, but the deeper you dig into the disaster, the stranger things become. Almost every evening, a black car sits parked near your house. A black Volga, as dark as the night itself. You are not a fool. You know your neighbors don't own a car like that. Most of them couldn't afford one in 10 years. And among your colleagues, there have always been rumors. Rumors that black Volgas belong either to high-ranking officials or to the KGB. But the car is not the only thing that changes. Strange people begin appearing around you. On your way to work, you notice the same man walking behind you. At first, nothing seems suspicious, but he appeared just as suddenly as the black Volga. You start seeing him everywhere. Once, twice, sometimes every day. At some point, coincidence stops being a convincing explanation. Eventually, you present your findings. You tell your superiors that the public deserves to know the truth, that these causes must not be hidden. They say nothing. They simply look at you. Days later, your documents are classified. Some are rewritten. Others disappear into Moscow's archives, never to be seen again. You and your colleagues are ordered to remain silent. And if anyone asks for an interview, you will say only what the authorities want you to say. Otherwise, you may find yourself sent far to the east of the country and forgotten. But consider yourself lucky, because one of your colleagues, the one who decided to challenge the system, was far less fortunate. Welcome to my channel. I don't know about you, but I love history, and honestly, I hope you do too. Today, we're going to examine the Chernobyl disaster that occurred on April 26, 1986, in the former Soviet Union, on the territory of what is now Ukraine. Many of you have probably seen the HBO miniseries Chernobyl, and because of that, you may already know at least part of this story. The series took some creative liberties, of course, but that's not what today's video is about. I'm not here to repeat the standard version of events or simply list dates and facts. Today, we're going to talk about the causes of the disaster that are mentioned far less often. Maybe you've heard about them before, maybe not. But if you're interested in the history of Chernobyl, I think you'll discover something new. So, let's investigate the real causes of the Chernobyl disaster together. For the sake of clarity, I've divided this story into 5 major causes that ultimately led to one of the greatest technological catastrophes in human history. But before we examine those causes, let's first look at the explanation that the Soviet Union presented to its own people and to the rest of the world. The official version stated, "The accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was caused by the plant operators who committed a series of serious violations of operating procedures and safety regulations during an experiment." But could a handful of operators really destroy one of the most powerful nuclear reactors in the Soviet Union? Or was there something much bigger hidden behind this official explanation? Let's go back in time and find out. No, earlier than that. exactly the right place. Cause number one, plan above all else. What do I mean by that? Let's start from a distance. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union's industry was growing rapidly. New factories were being built, new cities were emerging, heavy industry was expanding at an enormous pace, and all of it required one thing: electricity. Lots of it. This is where the Soviet leadership made a massive bet on nuclear power. Why nuclear energy? The answer was simple. It was relatively cheap, and it could produce enormous amounts of electricity. Nuclear power plants were expected to supply the country with affordable energy while also demonstrating the technological and scientific power of the Soviet Union to the rest of the world. One of those ambitious projects would become the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The first nuclear power station built on the territory of modern-day Ukraine. At first glance, it looked like a success story. A new city called Pripyat was rising next to the plant. New reactor units were coming online. Official reports celebrated the achievements of the Soviet nuclear industry. But there was one problem, a problem that wasn't immediately visible. The Soviet economy operated according to state plans. The government set specific goals and deadlines. Factory managers and plant directors were expected to meet them. Their careers, bonuses, and reputations depended on success. As a result, good news was always welcome. Bad news, not so much. Reporting achievements was easy. Reporting problems meant admitting delays, missed targets, and mistakes. And in a system built around fulfilling the plan, that could have serious consequences. This created a dangerous tendency across many sectors of Soviet industry, including nuclear power. Problems were often dealt with quietly, inside the system, without attracting unnecessary attention. At first glance, you might think this has nothing to do with Chernobyl, but you'd be wrong, because this atmosphere would play an important role in our investigation. Some problems become especially dangerous when nobody wants to talk about them. Cause Nom 2, the reactor with a dangerous secret. To understand what happened on the night of April 26, 1986, we first need to meet the main character of this story, the RBMK 1000 reactor. At the time, it was considered one of the greatest achievements of Soviet nuclear engineering. And to be fair, it had its advantages. RBK reactors were extremely powerful. They could generate enormous amounts of electricity, and their design allowed the Soviet Union to expand its nuclear industry relatively quickly. For a country whose demand for electricity kept growing, it looked like an excellent solution. But there was one problem: a dangerous secret hidden inside the reactor's design. Under certain conditions, the reactor could become unstable. Imagine a car that drives perfectly well most of the time. But if you reach a certain speed and turn the steering wheel in a particular way, the car suddenly becomes unpredictable. Most drivers would never know such a flaw even existed until one day everything goes wrong. The RBMK reactor had its own hidden dangers. And the most troubling part is that some of these design issues were known by certain specialists even before the Chernobyl disaster. However, information about these risks was not always fully communicated to the personnel operating the reactors. At first glance, this might not seem important. But our investigation has already taught us something. A hidden problem can become deadly when nobody talks about it. And now we have another question. If the reactor had dangerous design flaws, did the operators know about them? Cause no 3. What the operators didn't know. For many years, the public was given a very simple explanation. The operators destroyed the reactor. But if that is true, then we have to ask another question. Did the people in the control room know everything about the machine they were operating? The RBMK reactor was an incredibly complex system. Even experienced engineers could not know every aspect of its behavior on their own. The personnel relied on instructions, technical documentation, training programs, and information provided by the reactor's designers. And this is where another problem appears. Some of the reactor's dangerous characteristics were known a limited group of specialists before the disaster. But this information was not always passed on to plant operators in full. In other words, the people working at the station may not have fully understood how dangerous certain operating conditions could become. Imagine buying a car. You are given the owner's manual. You are taught how to drive it. You follow every instruction. But nobody tells you that under a specific set of conditions, the brakes might suddenly behave in an unexpected way. Would you still be responsible if an accident happened? Partly, yes. Entirely? That's a much more complicated question. The same dilemma exists here. This does not mean the operators made no mistakes. They did. But it does mean something else. Some of the decisions made that night may have been made without full knowledge of the risks involved. And if that's true, then another question emerges. How did the operators of one of the most powerful nuclear reactors in the Soviet Union end up in a situation where they did not know all of its dangerous characteristics? To answer that question, we have to return to the night of April 25 to 26, 1986, a night that began as a routine safety test and ended as one of the greatest technological disasters in human history. Was number 20, the experiment that went off script. Now we arrive at the events of April 25th, 1986. By itself, the experiment that was scheduled for that night was not reckless. It was not some secret Soviet project, and it certainly wasn't an attempt to push the reactor to its limits. In fact, the test had a perfectly reasonable purpose. The engineers wanted to know whether the spinning turbine could continue supplying electricity to the reactor's cooling pumps for a short period of time after a power loss. Why? Because when a reactor loses external power, its emergency diesel generators need time to start up. The question was simple. Could the turbine bridge that gap? In theory, this test was about improving safety. But as we've learned throughout this investigation, sometimes disasters begin with something as ordinary as a delay. The test was originally planned for the daytime. However, the electrical grids still needed power. The operators were instructed to postpone the shutdown. And just like that, the entire schedule changed. The experiment was pushed into the late evening and eventually handed over to the night shift. This does not mean the night shift was incompetent. Far from it. But the people who would ultimately conduct the test were not the same people who had originally prepared for it. The circumstances had changed, and the reactor itself was beginning to change as well. During the power reduction process, something unexpected happened. The reactor's power dropped far lower than intended, much lower. The reactor entered an operating state that had never been planned for this test. Imagine driving a car. Everything works normally at highway speed, but suddenly the engine nearly stalls. The vehicle begins to shake. The controls become unpredictable. You can still drive it, but you're no longer operating under normal conditions. The reactor was now in a similarly unstable state. At this point, every problem we've discussed so far began to converge. A system that prioritized completing the plan, a reactor with hidden design flaws, operators who did not possess all the information, and now an experiment that was no longer proceeding according to its original scenario. At this moment, nobody in the control room knew it, but the pieces were already falling into place. All that remained was a spark. Cosno 5, the night everything came together. April 26, 1986, 1:23 in the morning. Inside the control room of reactor number 4, nobody intended to destroy a nuclear reactor. Nobody expected to become part of history. To the operators, this was another shift, another technical procedure, another night at work. But by this point, every condition for disaster had already been created. A system that discouraged uncomfortable questions, a reactor hiding dangerous flaws, operators who did not possess the full picture, and a test that had drifted far away from its original plan. Everything was now in place. Only one final event remained. The test began. The turbines started slowing down. Conditions inside the reactor began changing rapidly. The operators saw parameters moving in dangerous directions. And then they pressed the emergency shutdown button, AZ5. According to logic, this should have been the end of the story. The emergency protection system was designed to shut the reactor down, to stop the chain reaction, to save the reactor. But instead, the exact opposite happened. Due to hidden design characteristics of the RBMK reactor, the first moments after pressing AZ5 caused a sudden increase in reactivity. The reactor's power surged. Within seconds, the situation became uncontrollable. Then, the first explosion. Moments later, the second. The reactor's massive upper biological shield was blown apart. Radioactive materials were hurled into the atmosphere, and in a matter of seconds, the world changed forever. The Chernobyl disaster had begun. Throughout this investigation, we searched for the person responsible, the one mistake, the one decision, the one guilty party. But by the end of our investigation, we discovered something far more disturbing. Chernobyl had no single culprit. It was not destroyed by one man, it was not destroyed by one button, and it was not destroyed by one experiment. The disaster was born from a chain of decisions, mistakes, design flaws, and systemic problems that had been developing for years. Any one of these factors, by itself, might never have caused a catastrophe. But on one spring night in 1986, they all met. And when they did, the result was Chernobyl. Sometimes the greatest disasters do not happen because someone makes one terrible mistake. Sometimes they happen because too many mistakes remain unnoticed for far too long. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is not just about the past. Sometimes it's a warning. See you in the next investigation.